There is a new BMW M3. We'd normally be very excited about that, but this time we're worried. And not just because of that grille.
If you ignore those gaping air intakes altogether, this new 6th generation M3 sort of looks okay, doesn't it? I mean, it's fine, but it's hardly a knockout. I thought the previous M3 looked superb with its perfectly flared arches and all that tension down the side of the car. This new one though, not so much.
Maybe that wouldn't matter if the M3's toughest competitor didn't look like this. Yep, the Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio is a stunner.
But styling is actually a fairly minor point when it comes to cars like these. We're much more interested in what they're like to drive. And we're quite worried about this new M3 because here in the UK you can only have it with an automatic gearbox. Not a DCT, an automatic. And soon there'll be a four-wheel drive model, a four-wheel drive M3. So what's this new model actually like to drive and how does it stack up next to the best sports saloon there is? Let's find out.
The UK market only gets the competition model, which is why there's no manual option. It costs £74,755. The engine is a new 3-litre twin-turbo straight 6, good for 510 horsepower and 479 pound-foot of torque. BMW says the M3 will hit 62 miles per hour in 3.9 seconds and run on to 180 miles per hour with the right options pack. But with a driver and fuel, it weighs 1,800 kilograms, almost 200 kilos more than the last M3. That's yet another reason to be concerned.
Wow, it's very orange in here. You're not going to mistake this car for a 320d now, are you? Yeah, these seats, they look fantastic. Actually, these are optional. They're part of the M Carbon pack. You need to spend the best part of £7,000 to get these seats and a few other bits of carbon around the car. Ultra supportive, but I suspect on a long journey they'll be quite unyielding. The seating position though is just about perfect. I'm sat on the deck. I can hardly see over the bonnet, which is the way I like it, and the steering wheel comes out to greet me. I've just noticed these carbon fibre gear shift paddles. They're pretty good, aren't they? The cabin quality has really been ramped up since the last car. It feels superb in here. Okay, let's talk about some of these exciting looking buttons down here. M mode is actually not what you think it is. That's just to do with driver assistance systems. You can turn them on and off depending if you're on the road, if you're driving in a sporty way, or if you're on track, in which case all those systems go off entirely. It's in setup where you start configuring the car. So you see you've got engine, chassis, steering, brake, and you've got efficient or comfort modes, sport modes, and then sport plus modes for the chassis and engine. It's quite easy to use this actually, it's good. And then look at this, M traction control. This is good. You can choose your stability control intervention, 0 to 10. That's pretty motorsport, isn't it? I like that. If I hold down the traction control button for a while, I get an option here called Start M Drift Analyzer. How good does that sound? So let's go into M Drift Analyzer. Attention, only use on private roads. Sure, okay. And look, it scores your drift for you out of 5 stars. Best drift, so it remembers distances and angles. And here we go, this is where you get your scores, yardage, all sorts of stuff. Understeer though. Imagine if you got a high score for understeer when you were trying to drift. I think we need to have a proper play with all this stuff on a circuit one day. First thing you notice when you drive this M3 Competition, they've not been shy with the spring rate. It does feel firm, this car. I'm in comfort mode and it feels tense, uptight. However, the suspension does round off the worst of the lumps and bumps in the road, so it's not unbearable. Nowhere near unbearable, actually. But I do suspect that around town at low speeds, this car is going to thump along a bit, and that might well get tiresome. On UK roads, I just can't imagine when you'd use Sport or Sport Plus for the dampers. When do you need even harder suspension? Maybe on the track, but not on the road. Okay, so what does this new M3 need to do? It needs to be less of a wild ride than the previous one. That car improved over the years, but when it arrived around 2014, my God, it was frightening. You could drive that car for 20 minutes and get out 5 years older. It really was a handful, that thing. And in the wet, it almost wasn't worth bothering. Traction was an issue, body control over lumps and crests was an issue. Even on a gear change, the rear axle could be so shocked that it would break traction and the rear end would try to get away from you. Straight away, you realise this is a much more sorted car. Body control is way better, all that spring rate will be helping there. And the rear axle just copes with the torque much more convincingly. Compared to the previous M3, this one is much easier to drive quickly. It's night and day. The older car would frighten you at every turn, but this one actually makes you feel confident. It's a huge, huge step forward. These modern M3s have all had one thing in common, and that's that their front axles just bite so hard. This one has got enormous front tyres, and they just claw into the tarmac so insistently. It just means on the road there is zero understeer, none whatsoever. Body control is really good. The car stays flat in corners. The steering isn't remotely talkative, but it's so directly connected to the front axle that you have faith in the front end, and the rate of response in the steering is really well judged. That just helps you lean on that front end grip and not leave anything in reserve. But there's no escaping the fact that this M3 feels big. It feels, at times, every one of its 1,800 kilograms. The engine is strong, really torquey, it's pretty energetic, but it's not a proper howler at the top end, not by any means. It's fairly responsive, not the sharpest turbo engine I've driven, and the sound in here is pretty muted, so it's like a facilitator for the rest of the car. It's not the heart of the car. And the gearbox, you're well aware that it's not a DCT, that it's an automatic. Mostly, it's pretty responsive, the shifts are quite quick, but when you ask for an upshift at the limiter, it labours, it takes its time. And when that happens, you do find yourself just longing for a slightly sharper upshift for, frankly, a DCT. The car feels massively quick. It really gets going. The rear axle does such a good job of putting all that power and torque down to the road. Haven't driven it in the wet, that might be a completely different matter, but in the dry, yeah, it's good. The car feels lovely when you tip it into a corner. There's just a little bit of body roll, so you're able to feel the grip building down the side of the car. It's got some of that edge and character that you want from a proper M car. It really does feel like a focused, single-minded kind of machine in that sense. The way it holds on around these long corners is like it's got infinite grip. Right away, it's a more convincing M3 than the last one, but it does feel big, it does feel its weight. Maybe a bit more like an M5. I think the M3 now occupies a space that you would have once found the M5 in. What's impressive is that despite all that spring rate, it does deal with a horrible lumpy bumpy surface. It does iron it out just enough. This is a very good car, you know. It really is. It has its limitations, its weight, its size, the gearbox is not quite there. That very tense ride at low speeds in particular. But they've done a good job with it, I have to say. The question is it better than that Alfa Romeo?
Here's a stat for you to chew on. The Giulia Quadrifoglio is 200 kilograms lighter than the M3. That's the equivalent of 2 big blokes. It has the same 510 horsepower as the M3, this time from a 2.9 litre twin-turbo V6. It does 0 to 62 in 3.9 seconds, just like the BMW, but it tops out at 190 miles per hour. It costs £67,995.
Alfa Romeo made some useful improvements to this car's interior when it facelifted this model last year, but even so, compared to the new M3's cabin, well, it feels like this car should cost literally half the price. There's no contest. But while the BMW absolutely trounces the Alfa when it comes to cabin quality, it's a slightly different story when you actually start driving the cars. Whereas the M3 immediately feels tense and quite firm, this Giulia Quadrifoglio is much more supple, it's fluid, it rides really well. In dynamic mode, you can knock the dampers back to their softest setting, and then you get this lovely, pliant, calm, settled ride. It's really impressive. This car's got much more incisive steering than the BMW. It's dartier, it's sharper, more responsive. And from inside the cabin, this car's V6 sounds so much better than the M3's straight six. It's way more tuneful in here. This is a more exciting engine, generally actually. It fades a little bit right at the top end, but it sounds better. It's more characterful. And both cars are massively quick, similar sorts of power, and they fly. Again, you're aware this is an automatic gearbox. It's fine most of the time, but sometimes it just labours a gear shift. Actually, I think it's better than the BMW's gearbox, but not by much. Like the M3, this has got tons of grip, good traction, a lovely, sweet, natural chassis balance. But the big difference between the two cars is how tense their rides are. That M3's is really uptight, and this Giulia's is lovely and relaxed and composed. That M3 Competition might be the new kid on the block, but there is still plenty it can learn from this old timer.
My winner is the Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio. I love its supple, fluid chassis. It just works so beautifully on Britain's bumpy roads. But the car is now 5 years old, and it feels every one of those, nowhere more so than within its cabin. And the M3, well, it just has a presence about it. On the right roads, it is spectacularly good to drive too. And then there's the cabin. I suspect that despite its very in-your-face styling, the vast majority of people would actually rather own the BMW than the Alfa Romeo. I'm just not one of them. Which of these two cars would you rather have? Let us know in the comments, and make sure you subscribe to the PistonHeads YouTube channel.